is Way Up with Angela Yee, and happy Wealth Wednesday. Of course, Stacey Tisdale is here.
Happy Wealth Wednesdays, everybody. We are going to educate you today in capitalism and all things capitalism and a form of capitalism that you've probably never thought about, Black capitalism, because we have the one and only Dr. Rachel Laryea, whose book, Black Capitalist, just came out a couple of weeks ago. Its full title is Black Capitalist, A Blueprint for What is Possible. Mm-hmm. Dr. Rachel is no slacker. She's currently in asset wealth management at J.P. Morgan Chase.
Period.
She's the founder of Kelawele, which is a lifestyle brand, but your plantains and your cookies and your brownies are what it's all about. And you have a plantain obsession, which we'll talk about. You're also an anthropologist.
Sheesh.
Mm-hmm. And your PhD is in African American Studies and Socioculture Anthropology. You've been featured in the Times, Forbes, everything, everywhere, and we're just so excited to have you and really proud that you wrote this book. It is fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Well, we have questions.
Okay.
But let's start with the basics. So what is the difference between Black capitalism and regular old capitalism?
Yeah, so I'll start with capitalism. Mm-hmm. It's really an economic system focused on private actors pursuing private ownership with the intention to yield excess capital. So it's really about profitability and about ownership. Black capitalism, in contrast, is really about how private actors, collectives can really reposition themselves within the economic system of today with the intention to yield excess capital, but then most importantly, really create social good as well. And so that becomes the core difference. It's about how can you also create avenues for ownership and thriving with that context of social good, which you don't have in a framework of capitalism.
Right. Capitalism, I think it's a bad rap, too, because people act like capitalist societies are really bad. Like when you hear about like, oh, yeah, it's capitalist. Oh, capitalism is, awful. But then we talk about Black capitalism and the need for it. There was one part in the book where you talk about being in church and why money is important when it comes not to just being able to have things, but also dignity.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's really the tools of capitalism can be neutral. It's just we're living in the history and the present of the racialization of these tools, which is why I think then people can have these really visceral and negative relationships to and reactions to capitalism. But if we really think about how we can use the tools of capitalism in new ways and restorative ways that create opportunities for social good, that we can tap into that in a kind of new form that I think ruptures preconceived notions about capitalism.
Let's give examples of that in action, because I know when I worked on Wall Street, a company, just like doctors take a Hippocratic oath, companies take an oath to make their shareholders as much money as possible. And a lot of people are like, well, why is this company being so bad? Their responsibilities to their shareholders, they never said it was anything different. Black capitalism, you're saying that necessary thing is paying it forward and community. And in your book, you give some incredible examples of people doing that. Isuzu comes to mind.
Yeah.
So talk about it in action.
Yeah. So you mentioned Isuzu. So one of the co-founders of that company, which is a unicorn business, by the way, they launched.
Tell people what a unicorn is.
Yes. It's $1 billion valuation for a business, which is huge. And so Wamimu Abbey, one of the co-founders, he launched that back in 2018 with his co-founder. And the work that they do is really about creating financial visibility for the country's most financially invisible people through credit reporting. And the belief is that if people can pay their rent on time, then you should also have access to credit worthiness. And so that's a B2B business, but it ultimately has value at the bottom line to the consumer, where they now get access to credit and access to mortgages, to different loans, personal loans, et cetera. And they've really unlocked millions of dollars of capital and credit and leverage in a financial sense to people that otherwise would have never had it. And so that's really focused on a business where they're not thinking about exploitation, they're not thinking about extraction. It's how can we create social good opportunity for people in a way that's clearly profitable than being a unicorn business. And so that's just one example. And I think it's not just from an entrepreneurial lens whereby you can practice Black capitalism. I work at J.P. Morgan Chase, and I spent a lot of time thinking in my seat within wealth management, what are the things that I can do to bring the resources within wealth management into the communities that I'm a part of outside of it? And whether it be people are thinking about recruitment, retention, of, diverse professionals. They're thinking about how they can bring in Black-owned businesses into the organization to get different scopes of work, different opportunities. There's so many different outlets to think about how can you just share capital resources in different ways, regardless of the seat that you're in.
I'm listening to you, and you're so soft. I mean, you're a tiger, but you're just so soft. And I know you were born in Ghana.
Well, I was born here, actually.
You're born here. You're a strong heritage connection to your family in Ghana.
Yeah.
And that's a culture where people are conditioned to be soft-spoken. That does not cut it on Wall Street. And you actually started at Goldman Sachs not knowing anything about finance. How did that happen, and how did you distinguish yourself as a Black woman in that situation?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I had no context for high finance whatsoever, but I happened to get recruited while I was an undergrad at NYU, and I didn't think anything of it. I was going to dismiss it, but it was my older brother who really kind of encouraged me to rethink that. He was like, this could change the trajectory of your career if you take on this internship at Goldman. And so
student loan debt and everything that you were fighting.
Yeah. And so even to intern at Goldman, that's what made the difference between me graduating debt-free and graduating with considerable debt. And so just having access to that opportunity was huge. But those kind of early days was a massive culture shock. On top of the fact that I was one of the few Black women in that space, and you're kind of vying for that full-time offer. You watch shows like Succession or Billions or Industry, and you think that's fiction, but so much of that is true in terms of what you go through, the toxicity sometimes of those spaces to get the offer, get the job, and have that sense
pitting Black people against Wall Street really pits Black people against each other.
Yeah. So it's like you have that cultural context, but then on top of it, as you mentioned, I have my own kind of ethnic cultural context of, humility, kind of subservience. Those are all kind of parts of the culture. And so when you're in a place like Goldman Sachs, you need to be as visible as possible. People need to hear you and see you in order for them to remember you. And so I'm then wrestling with, how do I do that when it feels so counter to how I've grown up and how I just kind of carry myself? And so those became the sets of challenges that I had, while also seeing for the first time what Black sociality and high finance can look like, how you can use the tools of capitalism in new ways that are productive for yourselves, for your communities. Because, when I was graduating NYU and going on to Goldman, so many of my classmates, they were going on to more quote unquote altruistic careers. They're like, how are you going to go to the belly of the beast, Wall Street? But then for me to see people engage in capitalism in these really complicated, nuanced ways gave me a lot of hope about the possibility about how we can really engage in this system in new ways that are going to really be restorative for us and get us closer to that point of liberation and economic freedom.
What's interesting is for you also being a business owner, and we were talking about this earlier, you ended up, you had a brick and mortar location, and when you knew it was time to close that down, you took a different type of approach that I've never heard of before.
Yeah.
So can you break that down?
Yeah, of course. So especially in a capitalist framework, right? An entrepreneur would say, all right, closing up shop, today's your last day, that's it. You figure it out. And there was no way that I could do that. I think for me, having a kind of Black capitalist framework and orientation, it was how can I make sure that all of my team members feel set up for whatever their next thing is going to be. So for me, that meant really spending time with them leading up to our close to say, hey, what are you really interested in? What are the things that really get you excited, passionate? What are you looking to get into? And then for me, it was how can I tap into my personal social network? What kind of research or different resources that I have access to that I can give and kind of share to make sure that they're set up for success, and spending time with each of them. So by the end and that closing day, they all had their next thing lined up. They all felt really kind of secure in what they were going to do next. And that was just part of what I just had to do as, their leader in that context, where I needed to feel responsible for them, and they also know that I valued them as people.
Someone called me the other day that they worked on something in my house, and they have, it was a business that was kind of newly launched when I used them, and she was like, man, it's been tough over here. They just closed with no any type of heads up notice, and now we're all out of a job, and people have these orders for their homes that they're not going to get, and I don't even know how to explain it. And it made her look bad because, you know, you work at this place, she's your connection to it, and then the place just shuts down. Everybody that worked there is like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do next? And then there's still clients that aren't going to get what it is that they were supposed to get. And who's going to explain all of that, you know?
Yeah.
So that's why I think that I've never heard of anybody doing that before.
Wow. Yeah, it was just incumbent upon me to like really make sure that my team was set, even though I was having this transition in the business. And I think that's also part of the responsibility when you're really invested in both profitability and social good. It's like, how can you secure the bag, secure the people in that process?
How do you feel about these Black-owned businesses that the community gets very upset when they're like, hey, they're selling a portion of it, you know, to a bigger conglomerate, and now, you know, people get very upset when that happens, and it's been an ongoing thing. We've seen it happen time after time, but people tell you when you own a business, you should be building it and scaling it so that at some point you are able to sell it. But in our community, we don't like to see that happen when we've been supporting a brand from the beginning that's Black-owned, women-owned, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to that, every entrepreneur has to do kind of what works for them, if it's a lifestyle brand or if you go into it with a kind of venture capital kind of trajectory. But especially when the critiques are, oh, you know, you're selling it, or, you know, you're kind of closing up shop, then the question becomes, well, have we done our work also as a community to sustain that business in a way where selling it doesn't have to even be an option, if that's something that's a concern? And so then the question, and I think also the responsibility is on us sometimes about when we talk about supporting Black-owned businesses, are we really about that through and through, and it's sustainable? It's not just kind of a one-time thing. And so I think when you also just have this unfortunate trend of Black-owned businesses closing because they can't sustain, the question's really on us around like, what are we doing to really create avenues for sustained ownership within our community as well?
You talk about that a lot, that there's, you know, questions that we need to ask ourselves when it comes to supporting Black capitalism and being in a capitalist society. But it's so strange to be Black in America and live within a system that was designed against you, that you actually built.
Yeah.
And you talk a lot about just kind of reframing that in your mind, like how you look at your job, and you give an example of a gentleman who used his job in finance just to learn skills to give to back to the community.
Yeah, and so that's actually the story you're talking about, is a man named Alex who works at Goldman Sachs, and he kind of describes himself as a spy. And his thinking is, I go into these institutional spaces knowing that I'm in them, but I'm not of them. It's an understanding that these spaces, these institutions weren't created for me to thrive, but yet I persisted and found myself in these spaces. So now how can I leverage these institutional resources, again, not just for myself, but also for my community who doesn't have the opportunity to be in this space like I do? And so I think that when there's that tension of wrestling around, it's hard to think about yourself being on the right side of something when you've been on the losing side for so long. And I think that's so much the narrative of Black people, the Black community, in the context of capitalism. But we also have more Black millionaires than we've ever had in this country to date. So how do we reconcile the tensions? And I think as, you know, financial literacy gets more and more democratized, we get access to knowledge, which knowledge is economic power, not just power, then the questions become, how do we sit with all of this intention? But of course, anchored on how do we make sure that our pursuit of economic thriving within the system that we're in is not dependent upon the exploitation of someone else.
Right.
And that's the really important part.
You write about that in your book when you talk about soft life and luxury and how that's a movement from exhaustion, people stepping back.
Yeah.
And how do you be part of that and Black luxury without... and still be a good Black capitalist.
Right. And that's part of the kind of self-reckoning that has to happen, because these different trends that we see, they're all expressions of a capitalist orientation. To tap into the soft life, which again, at its intention is really about rest as resistance to hustle culture and to the demands that capitalism places on us, disproportionately for Black and brown people. But to really live the soft life, it requires excess capital. It requires resources in order to do that. So then the question becomes, how do I engage in capitalism in such a way that allows me to tap into that while, again, not be exploitative? So perhaps some of those solutions are around, okay, I want to support brands that are focused on no exploitation, fair trade, et cetera. And so those becomes the sets of questions and also the responsibility that's on us and the honesty that's required to even recognize that, okay, soft life, Black woman luxury, that's all well and good that we want that and we want access to comfort, but it's also a reality check in terms of we're engaging in capitalism. It's not this kind of passive experience that we're having.
You know, with everything that's been going on right now, people can feel really defeated just financially and trying to figure out, okay, how can I get to this soft life, this luxury life when there's a lot of obstacles that people are facing right now. So what do you say to that, to somebody who's listening right now that's like, okay, great, I would love to be a Black capitalist. I would love to be able to, live this life, but also do social good and have that responsibility, but they don't know how.
Yeah. I think part of the trap of capitalism is it nurtures individualism. It nurtures this idea that we're in it alone. It's a dog-eat-dog kind of society. And so when we think about our financial futures and the dreams we have for ourselves, it can be very disparaging because then the question is like, well, how do I even achieve this? As if it's only something for you to achieve on your own. But that's where we have to kind of rupture our thinking because it's really in community that we're able to create economic security for ourselves and within a community context as well. And there are practical ways in which you do that. So what we mentioned Wamimu Abbey, co-founder of eSusu, but Susus themselves, yes, those are kind of traditional old school money pooling, money lending
Break
practices.
down what a Susu is.
Yes, so a Susu is when a group of people come together and they put in money into a pot. And at a regular cadence, if it's say your week, you'll get all of the money that we've pulled together. The next week or the next cadence, I would get those funds. And so those are not just the funds that I put in, but everybody in the pots who's contributed to it, I would get those resources. And so then that becomes money and resources that I can use to whatever kind of pursuit or goals that I have. And that's something we've been doing for years and years, and a very practical thing that we can do now. But again, it requires community in order to
Yes, it does.
Really
I remember during the pandemic, people were like,
did you Susu?
Join the Susu. No, I did not, because I knew what, at that time, it was a different type of situation happening during the pandemic.
Okay.
That was more like a pyramid scheme.
Oh, okay.
And that's the thing.
You got to be careful.
Yeah, I want to say that, yes, you do, because that at that time, it was not, I think, with the best of intentions.
I see.
You know what I mean? And I do think that we're in a unique space of we don't get the access to loans and funds the way other groups of people do. So we have been practicing that community coming together to make sure that we're able to open brick and mortar locations, or even just to have a business that can survive and thrive, because that's what, we're relying upon too. And I guess not by choice at first.
Yeah. I'll also say, though, I think for me, I really also tapped into institutional resources that I was affiliated with in order to even build Kilauea. And so, for example, I was at Yale studying for my graduate studies while I also started the business. And Yale has tremendous resources. And so they were writing me checks. They were getting me in front of mentors, different advisors who could help me. And that was huge for me to even be able to build my brick and mortar and then even have a location at the Barclay Center at that time. Even with Goldman, I was able to be part of their 10,000 Small Businesses program.
They do great work. And so does JP Morgan.
Yes.
I want to say that too.
Yes.
But sometimes that requires work on our part. And I want to say that, like you said, it's not an individual thing. And sometimes you feel like you just have to just work on the business. The business makes the money. That's how I do it. When there are places that you can go to and say, okay, I need, help raising money. I need some grant money. I need to figure this out. And it does require us doing that type of legwork and thinking outside of the traditional way.
Exactly. You got to get a little creative. I think the first business incubator that I was a part of was through New York City. through kind of just an initiative they had around helping entrepreneurs. It was a 10-week program at Brooklyn Library where I would meet other entrepreneurs. We would learn all the fundamentals of how to run a successful business.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are ways in which you can do this as well.
You make this all sound so effortless.
Oh, no,
and your
no.
perspective in the book is so beautiful. And you're, just the soft, kind energy. But it has not been easy for you.
No.
Not at all. And I know you coming up since your mother came over here from Ghana, and I know you went through a lot of imposter syndrome, not only being a Black person, but being a Black immigrant. You ran into some resistance in the Black community as well. How did that affect you?
You know, it really taught me that there's just so much nuance and complexity, I think, within the Black community. We talk about how it's not a monolith, right? But then to also experience that from the kind of immigrant experience. And something that really crystallized this for me was I went to an all-girls preparatory school for high school. And that was the first time I would say that I was met with kind of a Black American experience and how that differs from a kind of African experience and a Ghanaian one that I was having. And, you think we all look the same, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to jive and connect because there's kind of cultural dissonances. And especially growing up in the home that I did, my mom, so much and well-intentioned, but her attempt to create distance between herself and her family and what she saw was, the ills of racism kind of playing out in an American context was to say, hey, at home we're Ghanaian, first and foremost. And I didn't really have a context for what that meant, but then when I was, socializing in high school and I was seeing the differences play out, it kind of was just all these layers of how I felt marginalized or other or different in these contexts. And again, I think it gave me a vision or understanding for how all the different ways we have to think about this, and also all that we need to get aligned on when it comes to Black unification, even to strive when you're thinking about economic thriving and security. There's all these ways in which we have points of differentiation, but those should not be obstacles ultimately when we're thinking about this shared goal of how can we live lives of abundance,
Yeah, I can't stand seeing all the division that there is between, okay, I'm Black American, well, you're African, well, you're West Indian, well, you're this, so you're not Black. It's like that conversation to me is at the end of the day, when they see you, what are you?
Yeah.
Everyone's treated the same. A lot's going on there. We've spoken about this. Black immigrants create 30% more wealth than Black Americans. And it's a totally different sense of self and mindset. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, and I think something we had talked about that was like so spot on was that within the Black American lived experience, some of the rootedness is really around kind of imposter syndrome because it's a question of, well, where do I come from? Where are my roots? Where's home? Whereas for me, especially growing up in a Ghanaian home in America, I always was rooted to my Ghanaian culture. I was always rooted back to home and ocean away, and had a really clear understanding of where I come from and who I belong to. And so I think that gave me a different orientation to the kind of work that I could do, the life that I could have. And yes, it was a lot of hard work. It was a lot of challenges, but I didn't come from a rootedness and just not knowing kind of where I come from. And that kind of played out for me because we're all byproducts of our communities, our context, but then also kind of the foundation within which we come from. And if we don't have that rootedness, it can create a different set of outcomes as well. And so I think that adds to some of what people will say are those differences that we get caught up in. But again, it's like we can't end the conversation there, and the action has to, push past that.
We had Caroline Wenga on last week, and she has a book that just came out, and she's so connected to her African roots, and you see how that's affected her. And for Americans, Black Americans, that's just not there.
Right. She knows both sides of her family, the tribe, like everything.
Yeah,
and the whole history of who they were. How they,
and the values are in her.
That's why she has Wanga Woman. She knows exactly who she is.
And that disconnect that doesn't exist for Black Americans. Like my parents never talk about, they didn't know about that. They came from such abjunct, crazy situations in the South that it was, you have to, you super excel to make it here. So you know, to be Super Stacy, you have to, you know, have that, and that pressure. It's real for Black Americans, and it's a very different experience.
Yeah. And I acknowledge that. I think that it becomes a point that we have to talk about, regardless of how difficult it is. But then still think about, well, how do we address this in a community context to, you know, push past it?
What are your thoughts about attending a PWI also? I would love to hear that, because, as you know, I have friends who have kids now who are thinking about, like, oh, it's hard because I don't want my kid to be the only Black kid in the school. But then, you know, HBCUs, like attending an HBCU, I hear people talking about why they want to and how, you know, amazing it's been. But then I've also heard people be like, well, I don't want, that's not the real world. Yeah. So I want to know what your thoughts are, having experienced that.
PWI, I mean, it is not for the faint of heart to get through that experience. It was tough. I mean, I'll tell you stories of, you know, sometimes my mom would bring me Ghanaian food, and that was like comfort food for me because I went to a boarding school, and I would eat it in the storage closet because people would be so critical of, like, what's that? Yeah. It smells funny, you know, different things like that. And so in so many ways, it was just all these attempts to kind of strip me of my confidence and even that rootedness that I knew that I had. And, you know, I have friends who went to Howard, HBCUs, and even before they went, they thought, oh, this isn't realistic. Like, this isn't a kind of portrayal of what real life is going to look like. It's not going to be a setup for success. But then when they went through it, they were like, I would never trade that for anything. And even when I talk to some of my friends who teach at some HBCUs, they talk about the confidence of the students being different than some of their Black students in PWI places, because they just really get kind of this overpouring of love and confidence. And it's something so beautiful, I think, to be a Black student, be taught by Black professors, even to be in a context where you are really celebrated for who you are. There's nothing wrong with it. You're not going to be questioned in that sense. And so I would have loved to do that personally, because the PWI experience, it's challenging. But I will say, I think it did give me some strategies and tactics for how to navigate. I've been in spaces where I've been, you know, the other, or in these marginalized experiences. And so unfortunately you get used to it, but you kind of learn how you navigate those spaces. And it's required, I think, when you think about just how do you participate as a Black person in a capitalist context anyways. Right. You know?
It comes at such a cost.
Yeah.
Poster child for PWI, definitely the most defining thing I went through. And as I did a story, I believe when I was at CNN, on the director Andre Robert Lee, who wrote did the documentary Prep School Negro, about him growing up going to a prep school in Philly, but his mother was like poverty line. So he had the economic not fitting in and the PWI experience. And I went to interview him, and beautiful penthouse in Soho, and, you know, successful director. And I don't know why it just came up and out of me. I just looked at him and I'm like, are you broke? And he's like, how did you know that? And then, you know, I go into the research. People who grow up in that situation have a very, very, very distinct financial behavior pattern. That always assimilating and keeping up, that just becomes natural. And things like self-confidence and self-esteem can't develop because you're surviving. You're in survival mode to fit in. And they have a textbook financial pattern that, you know, leading to a lot of debt. And I know I've, you know, just been so on top of that for to make sure that, you know, my son went to this school, but I like started a diversity committee at his first school, you know, right on top of all of that. But it's a serious experience.
Yeah, it is.
And where we met at, had the honor of being in a book club that your book was. I kind of sat back and noticed that there was a lot of very, very successful Black people there. And I see where, like, a lot of the people I work with, a lot of the audiences I serve and stuff, don't relate to that group. And I saw how much that group didn't relate to the experience of everyday entrepreneurs. And I love the fact that you emphasize you don't necessarily have to, I'm not here to say get a college degree, get all that. There's other models for entrepreneurship. So tell us about those a little bit.
Yeah, you know, I think what's so important, especially in this framework for Black capitalism, is you could say, oh, this is really almost like an elite story to be a Black capitalist. And that's not the case by any means, because I think when you really think about social good and community orientation, that does require a level of organizing. So how can we all come together? Some folks might have more monetary resources than others, but that's not to say other folks don't have other resources, whether it be kind of social capital that they have or human capital or just things to offer, you know, to really get us to that place of a more kind of liberatory economic future that
Sweat
we're looking
equity
for.
is a
Yes, that's huge. And so we really have to kind of think about that because, yes, you know, in the context of what you raised, there can be this kind of dissonance or a lack of familiarity or engagement or an understanding that we all have different positions within the spectrum of capitalism that we live in. But, you know, when you think about entrepreneurship, even for my situation, like I started with a Kickstarter. I had $2,000 of my personal funds that I put in, you know, talked to friends and family, was able to cobble together another $2,000 and then really leaned into those institutional resources to then kind of build, you know, the building blocks of Kilauea and then getting the brick and mortar space, which I got through COVID. And that was a time where landlords were more reasonable, you know, with rents and everything like that. And so it was just kind of good timing, striking when the iron was hot. And then that was what kind of really gave me, you know, those first steps. And then also really focusing on being grassroots and really getting into the community, spending time there, and really letting that be the foundation to building my businesses, at least. And that's where I kind of saw success. So it didn't start from a place of just having excess resources by any means. It was very much a lean startup model where it was like everything that I do is because people are wanting to see it reflected in the business, whether it be a product or a distribution channel, et cetera.
I love that because part of what I'm trying to do now, like even with this building I have in Detroit, part of that is also making some of those units, you know, for people who are just as impacted and making sure that we're like, while I'm trying to make sure I build up my portfolio, I also want to make sure that it's doing something that's positive in the community. And so that's really the model that we're trying to follow, I think, in everything that we do. So I love that. And you talked about COVID times. I did the same thing, like just negotiating during that time. And being able, I want to ask you about also working in wealth management and financial planning and things like that. How important is it, you think, for people to actually go to experts that can help them when it comes to making sure that they're, you know, kind of maximizing what it is that they have when it comes to finances? Because we always talk about this. Sometimes people feel like, well, if I'm not rich, what do I need to even worry about that for?
Big misconception. It's like, if you can save, if you can invest, do it. Do it yesterday. Like, you know, get on it as soon as possible. And I will say, doing your homework is really important because there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. And, you know, we're also living in a time where getting an advisor can be very expensive when perhaps the kind of investing strategy that might work for you doesn't even require it. You might want to do a more kind of self-directed approach, which also doesn't mean, if you think like, oh, self-directed, I don't really have the knowledge, what does that mean? But there can be very simple ways, kind of building blocks to starting investing, even with, you know, minimal funds on a regular basis. But I would say, I think what's really important is investing consistently, and even kind of going through the volatilities that we might see that might create anxiety and worry and fear. You got to just keep doing it. Got to keep doing it, kind of chipping away at it. And like I said, I think we're in a time where financial knowledge is getting more and more democratized. And so it's not just this kind of thing that feels exclusionary or for elite people or something like that. And so tap in. You know, the time is now, and you can really kind of get into it regardless of how many funds you have. And so that's really important for people to know.
When you talk about Black capitalism, you know, we just had Target boycott. This community has so much economic power. And we've seen initiatives like Target, but we've never seen anything really turn into like a GameStop moment when everybody pulled all their money out of that stock and then really forced real change. But we have the power to do that. How do we click into that?
You know, while our kind of positionality within capitalism is evolving as Black people, the one that's been most familiar to us has been our kind of consumerist orientation. And to your point, that's where we have so much economic power. And so that's where that social good piece becomes really important, the community piece, and the shared objective around what are we really aiming to do collectively. Because again, capitalism as we know it, it's all about the individual. It's all about kind of creating distance between each other as we're all striving for profitability and excess resources. But if we can start looking at each other, talking to each other about what really matters to us collectively, what's going to get us to this next step, and how can we show it and negotiate for it with our dollars, which we use every day. And that's a symbol for how we vote every day. So we really have to think about it in that sense. And that's what then creates tangible change for us as well. And everybody can have access to that, you know.
Before you go, tell everyone about your bakery stuff and where they can get it. It's so good. I like can't stop. It's that good.
She's been talking about
It's that good.
Oh, so yes, Kalawele now, it's all e-commerce and wholesale. And so you can go to kalawelenyc.com, check out all the plantain goodies.
Spell that.
Yes, so that's KELEWELENYC.com. And we ship nationwide. If you're in New York City, you can go to Gin Jan, both their Harlem and their Brooklyn location, and Brooklyn Tea, the Brooklyn location, to get our
That's
goodies.
all right by me.
And what's your obsession with plantains?
Oh, you know, it's my plantain love story. It starts culturally. So Kalawele, long before it was the name of my business, it's the name of a popular Ghanaian street food. And it's basically ripe plantains coated in spices and ginger, and you fry it to golden perfection. And it's the most delicious thing. And so my mom would make that for me growing up as a kid. And then fast forward, you know, I start undergrad at NYU. I'm like on a budget. And I was also going plant-based at that time. And so plantains became a dairy substitute for me, a meat substitute. And you get like 4 for $1 at that time. Not so much anymore, you know. So I was eating them all the time. And then fast forward again, when I was in grad school, you know, taking my Anthro 101 classes, we anthropologists were so curious about culture, how it's created and sustained. And I kind of had this light bulb moment of thinking about plantains as a medium to really think about culture and identity, because even for me, I have familial kind of memories that are evoked when I eat plantains now that bring me back to my mom, my grandma, etc. And I can be West African, the next person from the Caribbean, the next person from Latin America. We're all eating plantains, even though we're preparing it differently. So I really wanted to build a business that really spoke to cultural connection, innovation, and familiarity as well.
Somehow this is all in your book. It is such a good book, everybody, honestly. Black Capitalist. And it came out just a few weeks ago. And where can people get it?
Anywhere books are sold, wherever you get your books.
Amazon.
Yeah.
And everybody watch the full interview on YouTube, and we'll have a link to her book.
So you can get it.
So that you can get it. But it is, you're just a delight, and your book is really groundbreaking stuff. And we are so excited that you stopped by to spend some time with us.
Thank you both
thank
so
you.
much.
We appreciate you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's a
you.
gift.
Black Capitalist, everybody. Get it on Amazon right now.